Thanks for inviting me out or inviting me over, whatever the thing is for remote invitations. It's good to be here today. So I'm going to just briefly, I know this is review for a lot of people, but I think it's important to sort of understand the different kinds of things that fall under citizen science. We'll start there first. So if you look at the left hand of this chart, this is more traditional science where professional scientists plan, design, and conduct the research. It's funded by government agencies, private companies, academic institutions, and citizens are not substantially involved in planning, designing, or conducting the research. And by citizens, I mean people that are not, this is not their career as a scientist. They're not professional scientists. Then on the other side, let's see, let's go to sort of in the middle here. In the middle, you start to have more involvement of citizens in research, but not completely fully in charge of the research yet. So professional scientists may partner with citizens to help plan, design, or conduct research. Government agencies and other groups may fund research and have substantial input into planning and design. So although citizens are substantially involved, they are not actually driving the research. And I think this is the kind of study that we just heard about, where I think the citizens were, important players in the data collection and things like that, but they were not actually designing the research. We have a lot of very interesting, important kinds of research here where you have citizens reviewing neuroimaging data or data on galaxies or asteroids, or I take it in the last presentation, the RNA degradation data that we had just looked at. Also things like community-based participatory research and health research, and these are in the middle category. And then on the right hand, you have things that are fully, totally citizen-driven, where professional scientists may help citizens, but they're not really the ones that are, driving the research, designing it, and so on. So you have things like that, or things like do-it-yourself science in biomedicine or biohacking, things like that. Amateur astronomy, amateur bird watching, bird counting, naturalist studies, citizens science projects involving sharing of genomic or health data just among citizens themselves. So these are the different kinds of ways that citizens can be involved in science. It's important. So let's talk a little bit about research ethics. What is that? Well, it's following the ethical and professional norms for research. It's making ethical decisions when faced with dilemmas in research, when you don't, the norms or the principles or values sort of pull in opposite directions or different directions, you don't really know what to do. And it's displaying ethical virtues in your research conduct, like being an honest person, having integrity, things like that. Why is it important? Well, I think it's pretty obvious why it's important. First of all, you need ethics to obtain the goals of research. If you're interested in getting knowledge, lying is not a good way to get there. It's also extremely important for promoting collaboration and trust among members of research teams, and trust in the research community. So this I think is very relevant to citizen science, where you have a lot of different people, I take it, potentially thousands of citizens contributing to a project. And you really need people to be on the same page about everything in terms of doing the research and trusting one another. It's also, of course, important for fostering public trust and support for research. And obviously, public trust is important for money. That's what people usually think of, is like, well, we need the public to give us money so we can do research. But it's also very important for the applications of research, and that you can develop all kinds of great scientific knowledge, and if the public doesn't trust science, they won't put it to good use. And we have seen this in the COVID-19 pandemic, and we see it generally with health research and other kinds of research where, because of distrust of science, the public does not, really take advantage of the research. So there have been a lot of ethical concerns about, ethics in professional science. We can talk about these some in the discussion a little toward the end if you want. There have been, first of all, a lot of infamous cases of data fabrication and falsification going back to the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2100s. Unfortunately, these cases keep popping up. And we do everything we can to try to discourage fabrication and falsification, but it still seems to happen. There are also concerns about the corrupting influence of private funding and financial interests in research. And we see that with a close connection between pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, software companies, all kinds of companies investing in research, and then them having an interest in biasing it in a certain direction. There have been abuses of human and animal subjects that have, some of these are historical examples like the Nazi experiments or the Tuskegee study, but there are also more recent things that have come up with this that are of a concern. There's dangerous or controversial research. Gain of function experiments in virology. We heard a lot about that with the COVID-19 pandemic and the so-called, the controversy over whether COVID-19 was in fact manufactured in a lab or escaped from a lab or something like that. We still don't know. It's kind of, haven't really figured that one out. But the bottom line is that it actually could have, because people have been doing experiments in virology that are dangerous. They've been doing these for quite a while, making microbes that have different functions are able to be more evade the immune system and be more deadly and things like that. Another issue in science ethics has been the growing number of retractions since 2000. So retraction is kind of like the most embarrassing or awful thing that can happen to you in science. You have to retract your paper because the data are not reliable. But retractions are also happening. It turns out most of the retractions are because of ethics issues, either data fabrication or falsification, or duplicate publication and plagiarism. These things have been detected by software programs now that can detect this. Now, some people argue that the growing number of retractions is not that bad of a thing because it just indicates more vigilance. Editors, authors, others are really trying to clean up the research record, and that can be a good thing. Others argue it's disturbing that it indicates that science is getting more unreliable. Finally, the reproducibility crisis in science, which is something that people who've studied science like me for a while have known that, not everything you see in the published literature is going to be reproducible. It's just the way it works. Peer review is not perfect. Things get through. And so this will happen. But in the early part of the 21st century, there was an effort to try to reproduce important studies in psychology, in experimental psychology, and there was also increased attention to preclinical studies in pharmacology and in toxicology in different fields. And what they found is that a substantial number of studies were not reproducible. And by reproducible, we mean with an accepted range of variation or an accepted range of statistical significance. So what is the government, how have scientists responded to these concerns? Well, we have federally mandated training in responsible conduct of research. And that's gotten more and more extensive. It started in the 1980s, late 80s, and was applied mostly to graduate students, but it has gotten more. At the NIH, for example, everybody in the intramural program at the NIH has to take training in responsible conduct research. Even the senior investigators who have been around for many years and think they know everything, they still have to do it. So this has been, an important thing. Funding agencies have also developed policies on research misconduct, conflicts of interest, data sharing, human subjects. Professional associations have ethics guides and codes. Journals, of course, have policies concerning misconduct, authorship, data sharing, and a lot of things. The universities have policies. And there's also been extensive research done on research ethics and integrity. Some of it conceptual or analytical, but a lot of it also empirical in terms of really, doing studies of, the literature and sources of bias and different problems that occur in science. So there have been some ethical concerns about citizen science that have been raised. And let me say at the outset that I'm not trying to cast any, trying to say anything really bad about citizen science. I think citizen science is a good thing, very good thing for citizens and science and the democratization of science. But there have been some issues that people have raised. It's not like there's been a lot of evidence. This whole topic is very new. It's like people haven't been studying citizen science to try to really figure out whether these things are happening. But the limited sort of studies that are out there and limited sort of reflection on it has come up with some of these concerns. First, there have been concerns about data quality, whether the data that is collected by citizens is as good as the data that would be collected by professional scientists in terms of recording it and keeping records as well. Concerns about record keeping in citizen science, whether that's good enough. Concerns that there may be data fabrication and falsification in citizen science, just like there is in professional science. Concerns about data analysis and interpretation possibly being biased in citizen science, whether there's rigorous study design. And this, I think, is more of a concern, not with the citizen science that is not done where in the middle of that chart, but on the far right where the citizens themselves are designing the studies. There's concern about physical, chemical, and biological safety in citizen science. I think this has come up a lot more with do-it-yourself biology projects where biohackers may be exposing themselves to dangerous things and exposing others to dangerous things, genetically modifying things right there in their garage, and possibly, infecting themselves with and other people with dangerous things. Protection of human and animal subjects. Citizens, some work with animals, but also a lot work with humans in terms of, you may have people doing their own human research. We've seen, again, do-it-yourself researchers where people are doing experiments on themselves or their friends or whatever. And there are, definite issues there about protecting human subjects. There are also issues about citizens who work with professional scientists being taken unfair advantage of. So there could be issues of exploitation of labor. So you have, citizens are a great source of labor for researchers, and a lot of research projects could not get done without the, the labor, the help of, hundreds or even thousands of citizen volunteers. This is a great thing. But there is the potential that the labor could be exploited, that people are not sufficiently rewarded for their contributions. This ties into the issue of authorship and acknowledgement, whether citizens should be authors on scientific papers, if that's, what they should be, the proper reward for what they've done, whether they should be acknowledged, how they should be acknowledged. Intellectual property rights, such as patents and copyrights. This may be an issue when in citizen science. I know there, could be a situation where you've developed some kind of, a patented invention or test or whatever as a result of citizen help. And then, what kind of intellectual property rights are they given? There have been issues where citizens have helped researchers, citizens groups have helped researchers develop genetic tests for rare diseases. And then the researchers in the university went and patented those tests, and the citizens that were involved in this were very upset. They didn't think it should be patented, and they were concerned about this. And so that was an issue. Data access and sharing and ownership issues. Citizens may have different ideas about this than professional scientists. Or maybe they're just conflicting understanding. I think that the sort of general norm in science is that you should make data freely available. It should be open to all, right, to help to advance science. But there are, some people, whether citizen groups may have this this concern, or whether it's private players or other people that do not want to share data for various reasons, and that can become an issue. There's also a concern, I think, that, and I've seen this particularly with some environmental health research that I've looked at, where citizen science is sometimes conducted in response to environmental, social, or political concerns. And this can be a very good thing, right? It gets people motivated and interested. I've seen some studies where citizens groups were concerned about fracking, right? They were, they're worried about how fracking is affecting human health and the environment. So they're going out and collecting a lot of data on water quality places where fracking is occurring. It's a good project, right? Good idea. It's good to get that information out there. But there is concern that because they have a particular slant on this, they're actually doing this for a particular political or social or other reason, that there could be bias. It could be, and bias, often is very tricky to get a hold of. It can affect what you're doing at a subconscious level. You may not even know that you're biased. That's often the case. And even if it's not biased, the public could perceive it as biased. So I think that's an issue that, definitely has to be addressed in science, whether you're talking about citizen science or professional science. So what are some responses to the concerns about citizen science? Well, education for citizens in scientific methods and ethics, and that is sort of what we're doing here. And a lot of people have argued that this will be very helpful to the citizen scientists to get some education on ethics. Also, there have been now citizen groups have developed codes of conduct for citizen science. There's a link there. I think citizenscience.org has a code of conduct for citizen science, and I've taken a look, and it's very similar to the code of conduct that you would see for professional science. And what are some of the things that you have in these codes? Well, most of the codes of conduct that you see in science talk about principles like this: honesty, objectivity, carefulness in terms of recording your data and doing your analysis and reducing experimental errors and things like that. rigor in terms of your research methods, your design, your analysis, openness, sharing your data, transparency, telling everybody about, your methods and how you did what you did, being completely transparent in your science. Confidentiality, protecting confidential information when it's appropriate, like human subjects data. That's an important concern. Accountability, the idea that, if something happens, if there's a problem with your research, a question about it, that you can be accountable. You can give an explanation of what you did, why you did it, who did what, and so forth. And there needs to be, this is very important and can be a challenge when you have very big research teams and keeping track of everybody and who did what. Giving credit for where it's due, but not where it's not due. That's an authorship issue. Respect for colleagues, respect for intellectual property, protection of human and animal research subjects, safety, stewardship, that's making good use of the resources that you have, respect for the law, professional responsibility, and social responsibility. That's, trying to do good for society and trying to avoid something where you would be doing harm. And that, social responsibility is a huge issue in areas of science, like I mentioned earlier, like gain of function research and virology. So let's talk a little bit now about research misconduct and questionable research practices. So research misconduct is behavior that is widely regarded as seriously unethical, whereas QRPs are behaviors that are ethically suspect or problematic, but they're not regarded as seriously unethical. So again, a sort of chart or table will be useful for helping us think about this. On the left hand, you see things that we'll all consider a research misconduct: data fabrication or falsification. On the right side, you see things that will say, well, yes, this is good science. This is how we should do science. So it would be honest, unbiased, transparent, and open reporting, analysis, and interpretation of data and images. In the middle there, you have things that are ethically questionable, like inappropriate exclusion of outliers, poor record keeping, p-hacking, and other questionable uses of statistics, careless preparation and selection of images, overstating the significance of your results, refusing to share data or materials after publication. On the left-hand side, we have plagiarism, which we'll all agree is seriously unethical. And then on the right-hand side, the appropriate behavior is appropriate citation and authorship attribution. In the middle here, we have things like inappropriate authorship, giving an authorship to someone that doesn't deserve it, or not giving authorship to someone who does deserve it. Text recycling, or what's called self-plagiarism sometimes, that is reusing your text without proper citation or attribution. There are also things that are called, that we'll call other misconduct, that it's not to say they're not important. They're very important to try to prevent, but we consider them other misconduct because they're not really unique to research. And we have various ways of dealing with them. So sexual and other harassment, bullying, inappropriate personal relationships, discrimination, fraud, financial fraud, mismanagement of funds. We'll all agree these are things that have to be avoided. They're misconduct, but we won't really call them research misconduct per se. So the most widely used definition of research misconduct is the federal definition, which is used by all federal agencies, and most universities have this as their definition, or they may go beyond this. They may include other things, but they at least include this. So research misconduct means fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. research misconduct does not include honest error or differences of opinion. So you can see from this definition, it really covers the whole process of research from proposing it to reporting it. But it doesn't include honest error and differences of opinion. And people who are accused of misconduct will often say their defense will be, it was a mistake, I didn't mean to do it, or we just have a disagreement about how to do science. And I've seen both of those things in cases that I've been involved in investigating. So fabrication is making up data or results and recording or reporting them. Falsification is manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. What usually gets people in trouble here, or what the most common type of falsification is when people are throwing out data, or they're manipulating digital images, something like that. Plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. And here's just some legal stuff. Finding under this part requires there be a significant departure from accepted practices of the relevant research community. What that means is if you really want to be able to prove something is misconduct, you have to have experts in the field that can tell you what good science is in this field and why these people deviated. And misconduct must be committed intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. That is, you did it in intent, you intended to do it in some way. It's not a mistake, not just a simple mistake. And it must be proven by a preponderance of evidence, which in the law means only that there's it's more likely that you did it than you didn't do it. So let's look at a case to discuss just some important points about ethics. So we'll look at Robert Millikan's case. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1923 for measuring the charge on an electron. What he did is he dropped, for his experiment, he dropped negatively charged oil droplets through positively charged plates. When the droplet was suspended in the air, the electrical force would be equal to the force of gravity, and he was able to determine the charge on the electron by calculating these forces. So here is a slide showing his experimental setup. Incidentally, Millikan had a graduate student, Harvey Fletcher, that suggested that he use oil drops for the experiment. Millikan had been using water droplets, but was not getting very good results. And Fletcher said, well, oil droplets, you can get a better, more consistent size of a droplet with oil than water. And so that was an important contribution. But interestingly, Fletcher was never mentioned in the published papers. So this is a significant omission by Millikan. But anyway, historians that have gone back to Millikan's notebooks, and if you want to, these are online, just search for Millikan's lab notebooks, found that he did not report 26% or 49 out of 189 observations that were marked as fair or poor, even though he said he reported all the observations in his paper. So Millikan, there's no question that he was right. His results have been validated by many other scientists. But there are questions about, was he ethical? Some have argued that his conduct was deceptive and that he falsified data. Others argued that he had a good understanding of his equipment and knew when it was working properly. He probably decided not to report observations resulting from error or inconsistency. And overall, this did not affect his results. So let's just have a little discussion here. I'll stop sharing for a second. Do you think that Millikan falsified data? Someone said this is a tricky one. Someone said no. If I would like to acknowledge here that Millikan is a problematic person in other ways, i.e. racist. I didn't know about that. Well, okay. There may be a lot of issues with Millikan. Well, I think that sounds like he should have reported the data and explained his reasoning. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, what most people would say today, you know, is that the way to handle this situation, okay, so you've got some experimental error and you're recording it. And maybe what you should do is like, you should have set up the experiment so you say, when an oil droplet is within this range of variation, I will accept it. When it falls outside this range, I'll say it's a poor oil droplet and I'll throw it out. So something in the protocol that actually explains and describes what data will be kept for analysis and what will be thrown out and why, right? You don't want to be just sort of willy-nilly ad hoc throwing out data, right? You got to have a good reason for, you know, why some data are included or not included in your analysis. And I think today, you know, what you might do is you might still allow all that data to be available maybe on a supplemental, you know, supplemental material or something like that, even if it's not presented in the paper. And I think it would certainly be deceptive to say that all data were presented in the paper because clearly they weren't. Okay, so let's go to another example. Dr. Smith is preparing a manuscript for submission to a prominent journal, is trying to decide the best way to present her image and gel data. She comes to you for advice about the following potential figures. She complains the best fluorescence images for a protein called excitin often have an unexplained bright blob of material that looks like junk and will be distracting to readers. So she's debating about what to do. So on the left, you have the original with the junk in it, the blob. Next to that, you have a image with a blob covered up by an inset. Then you have it fixed with Photoshop, and then you have it cropped out. Now the question is, what is the best practice for reporting this digital image? And would any of these be deceptive, or would they even constitute data fabrication or falsification? So take a look at these images for a second before, and we're going to try to have some kind of discussion. Does anybody, they should show it all. People are saying show it all. Does anybody think that, okay, the original with the explanation, I've often seen original and clean data provided and explain how it's clean. Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a way that it might be done. Cleaning. Now, I think everybody would agree that Photoshop would not be an acceptable way of cleaning the data, right? That's not the thing. That would be fabrication or falsification. But maybe you could crop the image and then say, this is a cropped image. And let's see, the Eterna example in our hybrid case, whoops. See where if I can get this, this might be relevant. Okay, well, maybe I don't know if I understand all that in the chat. So that, you know, you would make the full data available, the dirty image, the one that has not been cleaned up is supplemental material, and explain why you cleaned up. Now, there is one concern about not printing the full image. Do you know that what you're cropping out is junk, right? If you're absolutely sure it's junk, then yeah, cropping would seem to be okay. But, you know, if you don't know, then it could be an interesting piece of data that's not being shared, something that the scientific community might be missing out on, like a interesting fold in the protein or something like that. So, how would you prove that this blob is something that's not real? Well, you could, if you have the resources, you could try to take this image in a different, using a different equipment, having a different lab do it, see if you still get the same thing over and over again. And if you're getting the same thing over and over again, and in different ways of doing it, that's looking like it's a real thing and not just junk, right? So then you would have to, address that. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about data management. Data management is collection, ownership, storage, sharing, and protection of data. Good data management is essential for research integrity. Poor data management can lead to problems with reproducibility and allegations of research misconduct as well. Now, research records include a lot of things. Now, not all these things will you be keeping track of, but other scientists may be. But research record keeping is extremely important. Obviously, the most important record, perhaps the most important, is your data. But you also have protocols, research proposals, SOP, standard operating procedures, audit reports, lots of things where you need to be keeping good records of these things. It's so important. Now, there are a lot of ways of keeping data these days. Lab notebooks, computer files, machine outputs, and so forth. I think we're going more and more to electronic data keeping these days, and the NIH we're supposed to be converting to it by the end of this year, I think, to totally electronic lab notebooks. But it may take, it's going to be hard to do. It's going to take a lot of resources to get us all up to speed on that. So we may delay, but that's definitely the direction the research community is moving. So research records should allow others to re-execute your experiments. They should be clear, consistent, thorough, and annotated if appropriate, like, something odd happened with the data collection or there was some problem, you would, make a note. Accurate, well-organized, and indexed if appropriate. And the organization is becoming increasingly a problem in data collection because we have so much data from so many different sources. It's just, important to really keep things, organized so people can find the data. Signed and dated, and in English for US data keeping. Reviewing data is essential for quality control. Data, including raw data, should be reviewed by the leader of the research team or others on a regular basis. And auditing can also be a valuable tool for detecting errors, inconsistencies, and other problems. So you could audit you have a random audit where you take like a random sample of the data and you audit it. Or you could have a for cause audit, like if you found something misconduct or could just be a serious error or something else, you may have to just go back and audit all the data to make sure that everything is good. Storage of data. Data should be securely stored. Security can be physical or electronic. Data should be backed up. And data and other research records should be kept for at least 7 years after the completion of the project. Do you feel like you have received sufficient guidance on how to collect and store data? Do you know who to contact if you have questions about data collection and storage? So just have a quick question here for you citizen scientists. Do you think you've gotten good guidance on this? Someone said they've learned a few hard lessons. That's good. Sometimes the hard lessons are the best ones, right? You remember hard lessons. Yes, I've learned a lot. Okay, so that's good. I mean, I think that's that's very important that you're getting this guidance, because I can tell you that graduate students don't always get this guidance, and postdocs. I have a lot of people that in my classes, you know, I asked them, has anyone ever told you how to keep research records? And they say, no, no one ever taught me how to do this. They just assumed that I knew how to do it since I gotten this far along in science. But, you know, I'm glad that you guys are getting the guidance you need, and that's really important. Okay, so let me go on. Is data reviewed on a regular basis? Is it audited? Hopefully it is, and we can maybe discuss that at the end if people want to. Okay, let's talk about authorship. Authorship is an important for giving people credit for their intellectual contributions and holding people accountable if there's questions about research. It can help promote collaboration, is crucial for a career advancement. Unethical practices, as I mentioned earlier, honorary authorship, when you are given authorship even though you didn't make a substantial contribution, or ghost authorship, which may be more of a concern in citizen science, where you have made a substantial contribution, but you're not named as an author. These can undermine the integrity of research. So authorship has become more complex and contentious due to the increasing number of authors and the range of disciplines contributing and the different types of contributions. And I imagine this is a big issue in citizen science. Most journals have authorship policies, but these don't solve all the problems. There's always questions of whether someone made a significant contribution or not. And authorship disputes are common in science because so much is at stake. So I provide ethics consultation and advice for people at our institute. And the number one issue that people come to me with is an authorship issues. Those are things that seem to always be coming up. So here are the guidelines from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And I'd say most biomedical journals follow something like these. So it basically consists of you making a substantial contribution to conception, design, and work or acquisition, interpretation of the data, drafting the manuscript or revising it critically for intellectual content, final approval of the manuscript, and agreement to be accountable for the work and ensuring questions related to accuracy, integrity of any part are appropriately investigated and are resolved. So do you think citizen scientists meet or could meet the criteria of authorship? What do citizens need to do to qualify? Should citizen scientists be acknowledged if they're not listed as authors? So I'll stop right there. Someone said because of design, they could be an author. Controversial opinion. What about data collection? Designer are listed as co-authors. For Eterna.
Yeah, I was just you were just talking about the contribution and the author stuff, and being the contributor and all that stuff. And so like a problem that we've had or experienced, me particularly, is having a design like an RNA sequence in a paper that's pointed out, but then also your name isn't specifically in there. Maybe, but like you're only allowed to have your player name or even like your bot's name. And so like that's gets a little, so like, that's just an example that we've had. I think a couple people have also had that experience.
So why wouldn't you have your real name? Why would you have to have your player name? Is there some reason for that?
That's a long discussion that the papers, that's more of a Riju question, I think. I was just giving an example of just what we've experienced with what you were saying.
Okay. Jennifer, you've got your hand up. I think you're unmuted. Was that? Oh, Jennifer's muted now. Okay. Anyone else want to chime in on this issue of authorship? I think, one issue that I see is that if you have like 500 citizens contributing to a research project, collecting data for it, how can you give authorship to 500 people? And is it really appropriate? Now, I've seen it done in physics papers. There have been physics papers with 1,000 authors on them. So I guess it's possible. But I think more commonly in citizen science like this, where you have a lot of citizens collecting data, what you'll see is like the group will be attributed, like there will be an acknowledgement for the citizen group that helped collect data for the project. And that, will be, good enough for a lot of people. They don't really, feel like they need to be author, just if they get some kind of acknowledgement in the manuscript. That's important for, just making people feel appreciated for the work they've done. Okay, so, all right, so we're at the questions and general discussion part now. Does anyone have any other questions about ethics or things they want to contribute to our discussion before we wrap things up?
I can provide a little bit of additional context on the way that we've been handling attribution. So originally on kind of our first papers, I think the usage of player names was more or less, I think, just kind of done by default. We want to make sure that anyone who contributed, so basically the general guidelines that we use is that whenever players in some way contribute to a paper, so if they're submitting designs that wind up getting synthesized in experiments or have a chance to be synthesized, so if they're just getting submitted for a project, or if their designs are getting used in an algorithm or something like that, we have the an Eterna consortium or Eterna players consortium author that gets listed on the paper, and then supplemental material that includes all of the players' usernames and sometimes user IDs associated with it. And it was more recently that it came up that players may want to have their real names associated with it. And that is something that we allow for now. So like in your player profile, you can actually set your full name that will automatically get included. And on the recent papers, we've explicitly put out a news post or a forum post saying, hey, if you want your real name attached to this, let us know in case they didn't catch that. And for what we might notice as larger contributions, right? So it's which happens in some cases where players are kind of more directly involved in some of the analysis project and stuff like that. There have been a number of situations where players have been listed directly as co-authors.
So it's sort of it just depends sort of on what the extent of their involvement, right, is, whether it's substantial enough to warrant authorship.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not generally in favor of putting 1,000 authors on a paper. I don't think that's good, and I'm not applauding physicists for doing that. I guess they all need it for their careers or whatever, but I don't think it's generally a good thing. So I think that, giving some form of acknowledgement in the supplemental material or whatever, and then reserving the authorship for those that are really substantially involved, that seems to make more sense. Anything else?
Hi, this is Jill here. And I don't have a question, but continuing on, what Jennifer was saying is one of her designs, the image was used in one of the figures. And I think we usually put the name of the player most of the time. I don't know if we always have in all the papers, but I think we usually do say the player name, which is not a person's real name, because a lot of people like the anonymity of the player name. I've never seen that be converted to a person's real name, but that certainly seems like something we could discuss as a community going forward.
It's interesting to me that the journals would even allow you to put, well, for authorship, I don't think any journal would allow you to put a fake name.
No, it does not. And this is not authorship.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this person was
I-
not an author. It was strictly in the figure identifying the source of the figure, source of the image used.
This person was an author and a really valued author, but she submitted her solutions through a bot. So this is like another dimension, David, that we haven't, that is
Well, okay.
sort of a
here-
funny case in Eterna, but it shows up. You let folks.
Here's
submit
another
algorithms.
concern I have about this practice. I mean, it would be always important for you to be able to have a link to who the real person is, right? Because you don't want yourself to be in a situation where there's a question about data submitted by some player, and you can't even figure out who that player was, right? Then you're in trouble. You don't have accountability for data. So
Why is that a problem though? So in our case, we're testing experimental, the data
well,
themselves
suppose
are
someone
being-
says, I can't reproduce the data, or it's fabricated, it seems to be fabricated or falsified, and then you can't even say who provided it. That's the problem.
So in Eterna, the sequences are provided by players, but the wet lab data on those sequences are provided by, and this so far academic labs,
Okay, all
like
right.
graduate students and postdocs and faculty who have hopefully been trained or in ethical conduct of research and are fully accountable for the data. Yeah, but there was a set of controversies at some point. So in Eterna, players have written their own papers without
Yeah,
help from professional researchers like my lab at Stanford, and so that's resulted in a lot of interesting, also edge cases. There was one paper where the first authors were internal players, and they used their names, their player ID names, and the journal accepted it
oh,
and it went through peer review and everything. And then on the eve of publication, they sent a note to me. I was a co-author on that paper saying, something got triggered in our publication system. One of your author IDs has a number in their name. And we're not sure if that's ethical. So then the co-authors all, talked in an email thread, and I asked, okay, we can clear this, but if you are willing to provide your first and last names to be listed as co-authors, and they agreed.
yeah.
But there's a question in general then. I mean, do authors need to give their first and last names and full corresponding addresses and so forth? In that case, the journal was okay with us not providing all that detail, but providing a way to contact folks through the game. But it ended up being a pretty interesting
Well,
ethical
again,
question.
I would go to the sort of accountability thing that I think you want to know who these people are in case something happens. In case there's questions about the paper, you have to be able to hold people be accountable. Yeah, that would be the main thing. The only reason I could say an ethical reason for using a pseudonym is if you're worried about political repercussions, like your life might be in danger if someone found out that you were an author on this paper. I mean, I can see that. That would seem to, but other than things like that, I don't see a good reason for in a science paper using pseudonyms. Now, obviously, people do it in fiction all the time, but that's a whole different ballgame, right? We have players in those type of countries. Well, that might be, maybe this is a good discussion for the journals to have, a discussion about whether, it's okay to use pseudonyms and under what conditions it would be okay to use pseudonyms for authorship.
And I think to some degree, it also is tied to the concern, the levels of involvement to some degree, right? Because as far as being accountable, right, for the majority of players who are just submitting the designs, how much do they actually need to be held accountable for the designs themselves, right? Because that's not where the experimental results are coming from. Those are proposals, right? Those are kind of they're providing in some ways hypotheses, I suppose. It's not necessarily, you can't really falsify a hypothesis, I don't think, at least not in most cases.
No,
So, and that becomes, maybe less of a concern from that regard. And I think it's also interesting to consider I don't quite mean there's social or cultural aspects of particularly games, right? Because, it's a very common thing to work under, a pseudonym, and there are a number of players who, explicitly don't want to share their real names because of just personal privacy concerns. They came into it, they're like, oh, I want to play this game, I want to contribute, but I don't want information about myself to be publicly available on the internet, right? Tied with my activity in this game.
and that makes sense. But of course, if your game is somehow involved in drug or vaccine design or development, it kind of ups the ante. It's more than just a personal thing, then it's like a public thing. All right, well, thanks for having me out. This was a very interesting discussion. I learned a lot more about your type of citizen science research. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for inviting me.